November 14, 1943. Hill 217, Northern Italy. 0314 hours. *** Corporal Ethan Mercer crouched behind a shattered stone wall, breath clouding in freezing air, and heard something impossible. The German voices he'd been tracking for 20 minutes were now coming from 3 directions at once. Same voices, same cadence, same argument about rations. But they couldn't be in 3 places simultaneously. His hand hovered over the radio handset, throat dry, mind racing through explanations that made no sense. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a weapon cocked. The echo didn't come from where it should have. Mercer presses back against cold stone and realized with creeping dread that the valley itself had turned against him. Sound was lying. Direction was meaningless. And his entire platoon was about to walk into a trap built from nothing but reflected noise and one man's forbidden experiment with physics the Army had never authorized. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The trouble had started 6 weeks earlier, before the hills, before the ambush, before anyone understood that sound could be weaponized without firing a shot. It started in a Lancashire grammar school in 1931, where 12-year-old Ethan Mercer sat in the back row of Mr. Halloway's science class, tapping his pencil against a wooden desk in rhythmic patterns. Not out of boredom, but curiosity. Each tap produced a slightly different tone depending on where his pencil struck. Hollow near the edge, solid near the center. And if he tapped at just the right frequency, the entire desk vibrated, amplifying the sound until Mr. Halloway stopped mid-sentence and glared at him over wire-rimmed spectacles. Mercer had discovered resonance before he knew the word for it. He discovered something else that day, too, something that would matter a decade later on a frozen Italian hillside. When he tapped the desk at the precise moment another student coughed, the cough seemed to come from his direction instead. The sound merged, directions confused, and young Ethan Mercer, who should have been learning about photosynthesis, was instead learning that human ears could be tricked by timing and reflection. His father was a civil engineer who specialized in bridge construction, the kind of man who saw the world in load-bearing calculations and stress distribution. Their dinner conversations revolved around cantilevers and compression forces, while Mercer's mother served potatoes and shook her head at the technical jargon. But Ethan absorbed it all. He accompanied his father to job sites, watching crews erect massive steel structures across rivers and gorges. He noticed something the workers didn't mention, something his father dismissed as irrelevant. When workers shouted at each other from opposite ends of a bridge under construction, their voices did strange things. Sometimes words arrived twice, once directly and once as a delayed echo bouncing off the steel beams. Sometimes the echo arrived first if the beam network created a shorter reflected path than the direct line of sight. And sometimes if you stood in exactly the right spot beneath a partially completed arch, you could hear conversations happening 200 feet away as clearly as if the speaker stood beside you. The bridge beams acted as acoustic channels, focusing and redirecting sound waves in ways that defied intuition. Mercer started experimenting. He mapped the construction sites, noting where sounds amplified, where they disappeared, where they reflected in unexpected directions. His notebooks filled with sketches of beam angles and hand-drawn sound wave diagrams that would have impressed a university physics student. His father found them once, flipped through the pages with a frown, and said something that stuck with Ethan for years. "Interesting, son, but practically useless. We build bridges to carry weight, not sound. Focus on what matters." But to Mercer, it did matter. Sound was information. Direction was survival. And the ability to manipulate both was a weapon nobody had thought to forge. By the time war broke out in September 1939, Mercer was 20 years old, working as a junior surveyor for a Manchester engineering firm. He enlisted 3 weeks after the declaration, driven less by patriotic fervor than by a gnawing certainty that particular skills, his odd obsession with acoustic geometry, might actually prove useful in combat. The recruiting sergeant had other ideas. They looked at his engineering background and assigned him to the Royal Engineers, assuming he'd be building Bailey bridges under fire. Instead, after basic training revealed his uncanny ability to pinpoint enemy positions by sound alone, he was transferred to reconnaissance units and eventually ended up with the British 78th Infantry Division preparing for the Italian campaign. His official role was scout and forward observer. His unofficial role, the one he created for himself during long nights in North Africa, was mapping how sound behaved in different terrain. Desert acoustics were simple, almost boring. Open space, minimal reflection. Sound traveled straight and predictable. But mountains, valleys, urban ruins, those were different. Those were complicated three-dimensional puzzles where sound bounced, merged, split, and deceived. Those were places where Ethan Mercer could turn physics into an advantage. The Italian campaign began in September 1943 with landings at Salerno. Mercer's unit pushed north through brutal terrain, every mile contested, every hill fortress. The Germans fought with methodical ferocity, defending high ground and choke points with interlocking fields of fire. Standard infantry tactics applied, flanking maneuvers executed, casualties mounted. Mercer did his job, scouting forward positions, marking enemy locations, surviving. But he noticed something during the October fighting around Cassino. German patrols used sound discipline better than British forces did. They moved quietly, communicated with hand signals, and when they did speak, they positioned themselves near rock faces and ruins that distorted the direction of their voices. Whether by training or instinct, they understood what Mercer had learned in his father's bridge sites. Reflected sound was camouflage, and in the narrow valleys and boulder-strewn slopes of central Italy, acoustic camouflage was as valuable as visual concealment. He started testing small-scale tricks during his scouting runs, positioning himself near cliff faces and speaking loudly, creating an impression of multiple voices, tossing rocks to generate noise from directions opposite his actual location, using metal equipment to tap against stone surfaces, producing sharp, echoing cracks that sounded like rifle bolt cycling. None of it was sophisticated. None of it was part of any manual. But it worked. German sentries turned toward false sounds. Patrols hesitated, unsure of threat direction. And Mercer, watching through field glasses from concealed positions, cataloged every reaction, every moment of confusion, building a mental database of how soldiers responded to auditory deception. He knew he was on to something real, something exploitable. He also knew that explaining it to his commanding officer, Captain Harrington, would be nearly impossible. The British Army in 1943 valued aggression, firepower, and traditional infantry doctrine. It did not value corporals with theories about acoustic geometry. He tried anyway. Late October, after a particularly bloody engagement where a British platoon had walked into an ambush because they'd followed the sound of German voices straight into a machine gun nest, Mercer requested a meeting with Harrington. The captain was a competent officer, brave and fair, but not imaginative. He listened to Mercer's explanation of sound reflection, of how the Germans might be deliberately using terrain to distort acoustic information, with the expression of a man enduring a lecture on astrology. When Mercer finished, Harrington set down his tea, rubbed his eyes, and spoke carefully. "Corporal, I appreciate your initiative. Truly. But we're fighting a war with bullets and grenades, not sound waves. The enemy is using standard defensive tactics in favorable terrain. They're not performing acoustic magic tricks. Focus on the reconnaissance duties you're assigned. Report enemy positions. Mark minefields. Leave the tactical innovation to staff officers who have the training and authority to implement it." The dismissal stung, but Mercer expected it. What he didn't expect was Sergeant Bellamy's reaction. Bellamy was a veteran of North Africa, a hard man with cauliflower ear and a reputation for keeping his men alive through unorthodox thinking. He pulled Mercer aside after the meeting, lit a cigarette, and asked a single question. "Can you prove it works?" Mercer nodded. Bellamy exhaled smoke into the cold November air and made a decision that would save 37 lives 4 weeks later. "Then prove it small first. Don't ask permission. Don't write reports. Just use it on patrol and show results. If it works, I'll back you. If it doesn't, shut up about it and do your job." It was the closest thing to authorization Mercer would ever receive. He chose his test carefully. November 8th, a night patrol into contested territory northeast of their current positions. The mission objective was to probe German defenses and identify weak points in their line. Standard procedure involved stealth approach, visual reconnaissance, withdrawal before contact, Mercer had something else in mind. He brought along Private Jennings, a Welshman with a booming voice and a background in theater, and Corporal Harris, who'd worked in a Sheffield steel mill and understood how sound behaved in industrial environments. He briefed them quietly, away from the rest of the patrol, explaining the concept in terms they'd understand. We're going to make them think we're somewhere we're not. When we spot their positions, we use echoes and reflections to create phantom sounds. They react to the phantoms. We observe their real positions without exposing ourselves. Jennings grinned. Harris frowned but nodded. Both agreed to follow Mercer's lead. The patrol moved out at 2,200 hours under a moonless sky. Temperature dropping toward freezing. Visibility poor. They crossed the valley floor and began climbing the lower slopes of Hill 189, known to be occupied by German forward observers. Mercer led them along a route he'd scouted previously, a narrow draw bordered by tall rock formations that created natural acoustic channels. At 2,340 hours, they halted below a limestone outcropping. Mercer whispered instructions. Jennings moved 15 yards to the left, positioned himself near a vertical rock face, and waited. Harris stayed with Mercer. At the signal, a single low whistle, Jennings spoke in German, loud and clear. "Coffee is called." "The coffee is cold." His voice at the rock face reflected across the draw and bounced off a second formation 50 yards away. The echo was delayed, distorted, and seemed to originate from a completely different location, upslope and to the right. Mercer and Harris watched through the darkness. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then movement. A German sentry, maybe 80 yards upslope, shifted position and aimed his rifle toward the echo source, away from Jennings, away from the patrol's actual location. The sentry whispered something to a companion. Both stared into the wrong patch of darkness. Mercer marked their position on his map and led the patrol back down the slope, mission accomplished without firing a shot. Sergeant Bellamy reviewed the marked positions the next morning and cross-referenced them with subsequent artillery spotting reports. They matched. Mercer's acoustic trick had identified 2 German observation posts that visual reconnaissance had missed. Bellamy said nothing publicly, but he included Mercer in every subsequent patrol briefing and gave him latitude to experiment. Over the next 2 weeks, Mercer refined his techniques. He learned that sharp metallic sounds, like a bayonet tapped against a helmet, created the most convincing echoes. He discovered that timing was everything. Sounds had to be spaced irregularly to mimic natural human activity, not mechanical repetition. He found that certain rock formations, especially those with multiple angled surfaces, could split a single sound into 3 or 4 distinct echoes, creating an impression of squad where only one man stood. And he learned that soldiers, regardless of training, instinctively trusted their ears. When they heard a sound, they oriented toward it. And when acoustic geometry lied about the source, they oriented toward empty ground. The real test came on November 14th. Hill 217 was a German strongpoint blocking the British advance. Intelligence reported at least 1 reinforced platoon dug in on the summit, with machine gun positions covering all approach routes. A frontal assault would be costly. Flanking was impossible due to sheer cliffs on both sides. Command decided on a night attack, relying on surprise and artillery preparation. Captain Harrington called Mercer into command post 2 days before the assault and asked a question that surprised both of them. "Bellamy says you've been doing something unusual on patrols. Says it works. I don't need details, but I need to know if it can help us take that hill with fewer casualties." Mercer met his gaze and answered honestly. "I can make them confused about where we are. I can't make them retreat or surrender. But if confusion is enough, then yes, it can help." Harrington studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You'll go in with the lead platoon. Do what you do. If it saves one life, it was worth it." Mercer spent the next 48 hours preparing. He scouted the lower slopes of Hill 217, mapping every rock formation, every cliff face, every surface that could reflect sound. He identified 3 key positions where acoustic tricks would be most effective. He briefed Jennings, Harris, and 4 other men he trusted, explaining the plan in detail. They'd advance in 2 separate groups, separated by 50 yards. At predetermined intervals, they'd generate sounds designed to echo and create phantom sources. The Germans would hear movement in multiple directions, inflating their estimates of British strength, and hopefully dividing their defensive attention. Meanwhile, the actual assault force would advance along a narrow dead zone where sound didn't carry well, minimizing their acoustic signature. It was part deception, part physics experiment, and entirely dependent on terrain cooperation and enemy reaction. The assault began at 0245 hours on November 14th. Artillery pounded the summit for 15 minutes, then fell silent. The lead platoon, 39 men, including Mercer's team, began their climb. Temperature just below freezing. No moon. Cloud cover blocking starlight. They moved slowly, testing each foothold, weapons ready. At 0314 hours, they reached the first predetermined position, a cluster of boulders 70 yards below the German defensive line. Mercer signaled. Jennings, positioned behind a tall rock slab, knocked his rifle but against stone 3 times. The sound cracked across the hillside, echoed off a cliff face to the left, bounced back from another formation, and created a distinct impression of 3 separate sources. Mercer counted silently. 5 seconds. 10. Then he heard it. German voices, urgent, confused. Links. Neen, Rex. We veal. Left. No, right. How many? They were trying to pinpoint the sound and failing. Their uncertainty was audible. Harris moved to the second position, a natural amphitheater formed by curved rock walls. He dropped his canteen, metal clanging on stone. The amphitheater focused and amplified the sound, then threw it in multiple directions simultaneously. To anyone listening from above, it sounded like equipment being handled by several men in widely separated locations. More German voices, louder now, some shouting. Mercer heard boots scrambling, positions being adjusted. The defenders were reacting exactly as he'd hoped, spreading out to cover perceived threats that didn't exist. The actual British assault force, advancing to the acoustic dead zone 30 yards to the right, remained undetected. At 0322 hours, Mercer played his final card. He brought along a length of steel wire and 2 tin cups, improvised instruments from a week of tinkering. He stretched the wire between 2 rocks, creating a crude string telephone amplified by the cups. When he struck the wire sharply, it vibrated and transmitted sound along its length, producing a metallic hum that resonated from both ends simultaneously. The Germans heard mechanical noise from 2 sources 40 feet apart, suggesting equipment or weapons being positioned. Someone shouted orders in German. A machine gun opened fire, tracers arcing into empty darkness, aimed at one of the phantom sounds. The muzzle flash revealed the gun's exact position. British troops who'd advanced undetected during confusion responded immediately. Grenades arced toward the flash. Explosions rippled across the slope. The machine gun went silent. What happened next unfolded in violent chaos. The German defenders, convinced they were surrounded or at least engaged from multiple directions, fragmented their response. Some fired toward the echoes. Others held position, waiting for targets that never appeared in the places they'd heard sounds. Their cohesion broke. The British assault force, having closed to within 20 yards during confusion, attacked the revealed positions with overwhelming close-range firepower. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. By 0340 hours, Hill 217 summit was in British hands. Total British casualties for wounded, none killed. German casualties were higher, but most of the defending platoon retreated down the far slope in disorder rather than fighting to the last man. They'd lost confidence in their situational awareness. When you can't trust what you hear, when every sound might be deception, aggression collapses into hesitation. Captain Harrington found Mercer after dawn, sitting on a limestone boulder with his back against stone, exhausted and shivering. The captain said nothing at first, just handed him a canteen of hot tea laced with rum. Then he spoke quietly. "I don't understand what you did." Bellamy tried to explain it, "and I still don't fully understand. But I counted the casualties. 4 wounded, 0 dead, on an assault that should have cost us 15 or 20. So whatever it was you did with sounds and rocks, it worked. I'm recommending you for a commendation, though I'm not sure how to describe the action in the report." The commendation never came. Mercer didn't care. What mattered was that word spread. Other platoons wanted to know the trick. Bellamy organized informal training sessions where Mercer explained the basics of acoustic reflection and battlefield deception. He taught them to recognize terrain that amplified or distorted sound. He demonstrated how to create false signatures using equipment they already carried. He emphasized timing and spacing, the difference between effective deception and obvious fakery. Some men got it immediately. Others struggled with the concept, unable to visualize sound as something you could aim and shape. But enough learned that within 3 weeks, variations of Mercer's bridge beam echo trick were being used across the entire division's front. The Germans noticed. Intercepted radio traffic in late November included references to Geistergeräusch or ghost sounds. Defensive positions began incorporating acoustic countermeasures, using canvas sheets and sandbag baffles to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Some units adopted strict noise discipline, refusing to react to auditory contacts without visual confirmation. The adaptation was incomplete and inconsistent, but it showed that Mercer's innovation had become significant enough to require response. Sound had joined smoke, camouflage, and radio deception in the toolkit of battlefield tricks. But the formal British Army never acknowledged it. No doctrine was updated. No training manuals revised. Staff officers in rear headquarters wrote reports attributing successes to improved reconnaissance and aggressive patrol tactics without mentioning acoustic deception. When Mercer was finally promoted to sergeant in January 1944, the promotion citation referenced exceptional scouting ability and leadership under fire, but said nothing about the specific innovation that had saved dozens of lives. It was as if the institution couldn't process something that fell outside existing categories. Soldiers understood. Officers in the field understood. But the bureaucratic machinery of military knowledge management ignored what it couldn't easily codify. Mercer survived the Italian campaign. He fought through Cassino, Anzio, and the Gothic Line. He used his acoustic tricks whenever terrain allowed, refining them, teaching them, watching other men adopt and adapt them. He saw the limits too, in open terrain or urban rubble. Reflection was too chaotic to control. Against disciplined troops with good fire control, confusion lasted only seconds before training reasserted itself. The trick worked best in specific geography against moderately trained defenders under stress, a narrow window of effectiveness. But within that window, it was devastatingly useful. The war ended. Mercer returned to England in late 1945, accepted a job with a civil engineering firm, and resumed a quiet civilian life. He married in 1947, had 2 daughters, and spent 30 years designing infrastructure projects that had nothing to do with sound or warfare. He never wrote about his wartime innovation. No memoirs, no lectures, no attempts to claim credit. When his daughters asked about the war, he told them standard stories about cold nights and bad food, never mentioning that he'd turned his childhood observations about bridge acoustics into a tactical weapon. He was content to let it fade. But the idea didn't fade entirely. In the 1960s, military researchers studying acoustic warfare stumbled upon references to ghost sound tactics used by British forces in Italy. They tracked down after-action reports, interviewed veterans, and eventually found Mercer. A young lieutenant colonel visited him in 1968, asked detailed questions about the Hill 217 assault, and took extensive notes. Mercer answered politely, but without enthusiasm. The officer asked why he'd never pursued formal recognition. Mercer's response was simple. It worked because nobody expected it. If I'd made it official, written it down in manuals, the Germans would have learned it and countered it faster. Keeping it informal, soldier to soldier, kept it effective longer. Recognition would have killed its usefulness. The lieutenant colonel left with his notes. Some of that material filtered into acoustic warfare studies conducted during the Vietnam era, influencing how special forces thought about sound discipline and auditory deception in jungle terrain. The connection was indirect, filtered through multiple layers of doctrinal development. But Mercer's core insight that reflected sound could be weaponized through understanding terrain geometry became a quiet footnote in the evolution of battlefield tactics. Ethan Mercer died in 1989 at 70 years old. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his war service in a single line, nothing about acoustic deception or the men who lived because he'd understood how sound bounced off rocks. His daughters found his old notebooks when clearing out his study, pages filled with sketches of bridge beams and sound wave diagrams from the 1930s, alongside wartime maps marked with reflection angles and echo timings. They donated them to the Imperial War Museum, where they sit in an archive box, rarely examined, a record of innovation that official histories overlooked. But in veteran communities, especially among men who served in the Italian campaign, a story circulated. The story of a corporal who could make the enemy hear things that weren't there, who turned hillsides into echo chambers and confusion into tactical advantage. The details varied in the retellings. Some versions exaggerated the effect, claiming entire battalions were routed by phantom sounds. Others minimized it, reducing it to clever use of terrain. The truth was somewhere between a modest but real innovation that exploited a gap in military thinking about sound. The broader lesson was harder to articulate, but more important. Modern warfare in 1943 was becoming increasingly technological. Radio, radar, aerial reconnaissance, these were the glamorous innovations that won headlines and budget allocations. But Mercer's trick required no technology beyond a soldier's voice and the laws of physics. It was ancient in principle, a cousin of Bronze Age warriors shouting in caves to sound more numerous. What made it modern was deliberate application, systematic mapping of acoustic terrain, and disciplined integration with conventional tactics. It proved that low-tech creativity could still matter, that understanding the physical environment could be as valuable as possessing advanced equipment. The Italian mountains where Mercer conducted his experiments are quiet now. The bunkers and fighting positions have weathered into ruins or been reclaimed by forest. Hill 217 is a hiking destination, its wartime significance marked by a small memorial plaque that mentions the date of the assault, but none of the acoustic deception that made it less bloody than it might have been. If you stand in the right spot, near the boulder cluster at the 0314 position, and make a sharp sound, you can still hear the echoes split and reflect off the rock faces just as they did in 1943. The physics hasn't changed. The valley still plays tricks with sound. But nobody is listening for a tactical advantage anymore. Mercer never sought recognition, but in not seeking it, he achieved something arguably more valuable. His innovation spread organically, taught soldier to soldier, adapted and modified by each unit that used it. It wasn't frozen in doctrine or stifled by bureaucratic approval processes. It remained fluid and alive, exactly what battlefield innovation should be. And because it was never officially credited to him, it couldn't be officially ignored or dismissed when military fashions changed. It simply existed as part of the practical knowledge that soldiers passed down through experience. There's an irony in how warfare remembers innovation. The grand technological leaps, the radar systems and code-breaking machines, are documented and celebrated. But the small tactical tricks, the field expedient solutions that save handfuls of lives in specific places, those often vanish unless someone deliberately preserves them. Mercer's bridge beam echo trick survived longer than most because it was simple enough to explain in a 10-minute conversation and useful enough that men who learned it taught it to others. It didn't require institutional support to propagate. It just needed soldiers who wanted to survive and were willing to try something unconventional. In the end, Ethan Mercer's story is about seeing connections others missed, between childhood curiosity and wartime necessity, between civil engineering and tactical deception, between the predictable behavior of sound waves and the unpredictable chaos of combat. He took a mundane observation about bridge construction and forged it into a weapon that existed only in the minds of confused enemies who heard threats that weren't there. He proved that physics could be as deadly as bullets if you understood it well enough, and that the most effective innovations sometimes come from the least expected sources, not from staff colleges or research laboratories, but from a man who'd spent his childhood tapping on desks and listening to how buildings talk back. The men who walked up Hill 217 on November 14, 1943, didn't know they were participating in an acoustic warfare experiment. They just knew they reached the top with fewer casualties than expected, that the enemy had seemed confused, that something about the assault felt different even if they couldn't articulate exactly what. That was enough. That was everything. Because in war, the difference between a successful innovation and a forgotten idea often comes down to a single question. Did it bring people home alive? Mercer's trick did. 37 men who might have died on that frozen slope in central Italy survived to see the sunrise because sound had lied about where the threat was coming from. That's not the kind of achievement that gets you medals or mentions in grand histories, but it's the kind that matters most to the people who lived through it, and in the quiet corners of veteran memory, where the real stories of how wars are actually fought get preserved. Ethan Mercer's name endures not as a hero or a genius, but as a man who understood that sometimes the best weapon is the one the enemy never sees coming, because it doesn't exist in any form except the echoes in their own ears telling them to look the wrong way at the wrong time. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below.